Colleagues, welcome to CG Seminar 215, and we've got a really interesting topic today. And King Alexander from the US, who's currently at Oxford, will lead us through it. Before I introduce him, let me take you through the webinar protocols in the usual way. Remember that the webinar is being recorded. It'll be posted online in the CG website in due course. It appears on YouTube, usually within 48 hours of the event, often less than that. A transcript of the chat function will also be posted. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question, and there's no need to have your video on during the webinar. But we advise you to turn it on when you're taking part in the Q&A. We recommend using the speaker's view so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function. Write your question out there. If you want to make a statement, you can also do that. But give us a warning of what you want to say, and we select the participants in the Q&A on the basis of what is appearing in the chat. So good idea to make your question or your statement relevant to what the speaker has been presenting about. At the end of the speaker's time, we'll then start the Q&A, and I'll give you a warning if you're being invited into the Q&A, as most people who come into the chat will be. At that point, I'll invite you in by name. And when that happens, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and then start by stating your name and where you were from. Now, I'm really delighted to introduce Fielden King Alexander. King is one of the experts on higher education in the United States, a noted academic scholar and a national leader who's been an institutional president in higher education. He's been an expert witness in the US Senate and House of Representatives congressional hearings many times. He's contributed to many academic publications. I think, King, you worked on the Walter McMahon study of public and private goods in higher education, which many of us still swear by and use frequently. He's also been a contributor to public discussion of higher education through notable media such as Financial Times, The Economist, Washington Post, Politico, Policy Matters, and so on. King, I now hand over to you. The screen is yours, and you'll take us through your topic, and then we'll have a discussion.
I will, Simon, and thank you, Simon, for that introduction, and I welcome everybody from around the world. And I see a couple of dear friends who know this discussion very well because they're trying to remedy it in many ways. In many ways, this is kind of a warning about what not to do as we have privatized the public higher education system and the American higher education system, while at the same time we've almost federalized the higher education system and allowed our states to get out of their responsibilities. When all this started, if you go back, the history of this is very important because politics plays a critical role, both institutional politics as well as national politics. But if we go back to the great debate that occurred in the United States from 65 to 72 about how we expand access, what many people don't realize is that debate also was about how do we save the private higher education system, because there were great concerns from many of the wealthiest institutions in the world at the time, but concerns about whether students would attend private higher education. So in 72, as we roll into the 50th anniversary of the Pell Grant, and as we talk about even doubling Pell, at the same time as we're trying to get costs under control, cost control, and we're dealing with $1.7 trillion in student indebtedness, all of these are consequences of decisions that were made 50 years ago. And I'll kind of lay out the background of that. The great debate that occurred in the United States was whether we fund institutions directly for expanding access to low-income populations, or do we take a Milton Friedman approach, a market-based, more capitalistic approach, and open it up and allow students to pick and choose wherever they want to go and take public funds with them. Now, this is unusual by international standards, since we're the only country that I would consider that runs a wild west of higher education. At the time, we were attempting that we had 33,200 institutions eligible for public funds if the federal government adopted the voucher approach. Today, we have nearly 6,000 institutions receiving that are eligible for these federal funds. And the federal government now, which was supposed to augment what states do, now constitutes about $175 billion, including tuition tax credits, while the states are only contributing a little more than 90 billion. So the federal government has become the prime revenue supplier through tuition-based assistance programs, which has allowed many institutions that control their tuition to escalate their tuition when they can. And for many institutions, an entire sector was created called the for-profit sector institutions that now we're trying to reel them in, because probably the big mistake that we made in 72, in addition to just going to a voucher system, was that the authority for those revenues was not vested in the Department of Education, was not vested in the ministries of education, but was vested in private accrediting bodies. These private accrediting bodies have now, as I mentioned, have accredited nearly 6,000 institutions of higher education. All of those institutions are not market-based, they're publicly funded. And the intent in the beginning was to expand access and expand choice for low-income students. Well, that really hasn't happened. And in fact, if you take a look at just picking on the Ivy League, eight institutions with nearly 200 billion in endowments, which, as the International Monetary Fund has stated, that's greater than the GDP of New Zealand, Finland, and Chile, just in their endowments. The entire Ivy League has nearly basically about 10,000 low-income students. And that is not many compared to, say, Cal State institutions, where a single institution has nearly 15 to 16, 17,000 of these low-income students. So what we've done is fund this market-based approach that has driven many institutions into more privatization, including public institutions. And we've also incentivized at the federal level. We've incentivized our state governments to back out of their funding responsibilities. And so what has happened since 1980 is state funding for higher education in measuring tax effort is down 55%. States are now putting in 25 to 35% of the funds for their public institutions, as opposed to 80%. And this disinvestment in higher education at the state level has shifted state investment from legislative tax-paying citizens at the state level to the federal government and tuition-based systems, making higher education and justifying in some ways the state legislative assumptions that this is an individual benefit, not a societal benefit, taking the responsibility off the baby boomers or the aging American taxpayers, taking that responsibility off their backs and shifting it to the next generation of students. And one consequence of this has been that we have a student loan crisis of $1.7 trillion. Now we're trying to buy out the student loans at the federal level. Another consequence of this is a rapid escalation of state merit-based aid that has gone to middle income and upper income families in many states, in as many as 15 to 20 states, that because the college cost crisis has impacted middle income families, they've turned it into a political football in many states, including Louisiana. Georgia started it with the Hope Scholarships. So, and in addition to that, we've seen all these other consequences emerge. The American Opportunity Tax Credit was expanded under the Obama administration. It was expanded to families that used to be up to 60,000. Now it's up to 180,000, of which 55% of the American parents are taking a $2,500 tax credit to offset the tuition costs that have grown, and mostly in our public institutions, because of state disinvestment in these institutions, resulting in tuition and fee increases. So here we are today in a situation that when this debate occurred from 65 to 72, the United States did lead the world in access to college. It was a democratized system. We did lead the world in the number of graduates that were being produced. And in fact, our 55 to 64-year-olds in the United States still rank #1 in the world among OECD nations in the percent that have college degrees. However, our 25 to 34-year-olds 50 years later in this market-based privatization model, our 25 to 34-year-olds rank 16th in the OECD category of students, graduates with baccalaureate degrees, and 11th, we've dropped to 11th in those with less than baccalaureate degrees. And those numbers are declining comparatively with our peer OECD countries internationally. So what I'm advocating, and I know we've got many that are working on this, is not to keep pouring money into financial aid unless we stop our states from backing out and we incentivize our states to put more money into public higher education to either produce greater affordability before our states turn the entire system into a market-based, tuition-based federal model. And if this design was to protect our private institutions, which it was, assuming the states would always protect our publics, the states haven't protected the public colleges and universities. They have backed out of their responsibilities. We have done very well in protecting our private sector in higher education, to the extent that now twice as many institutions are eligible for financial aid, federal financial aid, that many of those institutions are at least 90% reliant on those public funds. So this is a warning to other nations that see, and England has moved in this direction, certainly. Since the Higher Education Act in 92, the reliance, they didn't put any more money into higher education, but they relied on international students to fund access. Well, now we have public institutions in the United States that are accepting 70 to 80% of their freshman classes are out-of-state students that are coming in with more revenues at the expense of the in-state students that need those public institutions the most. These are all consequences of a debate that went the wrong way in 1972 from 65 to 72. We made some important assumptions about what states would continue to do, and states have now not done this, and they have figured out that they can get reelected by allowing institutions to raise tuition and fees, not for them to raise taxes in support of the next generation. So there has not been much improvement at all in terms of low-income access to many of these institutions that promised to expand their access. And I remember reading in the debates, and Gladys Willanen will certainly point this out, the debates when the University of Chicago said, if you allow us to receive public funds through this market-based approach, we will look more like the University of Illinois years from now, decades from now, in terms of access. What has happened is the University of Illinois looks a lot more like the University of Chicago in terms of access. The University of Chicago is just as selective as they've ever been. And so have the Ivy League institutions that used to admit 40% of their admissions class. Now they're admitting 3.4% of those that apply to these institutions, of those institutions that are the richest in the world. And nobody has held private higher education accountable. So my point in adopting this market-based academic capitalism that has pushed many public institutions into trying to privatize themselves, my point is we have done a great job in the last 50 years, not only protecting private higher education and tuition-based models, but doubling the number of institutions receiving these public funds at the expense of our public institutions, which are struggling. Those that can't privatize are struggling to fund themselves, continue to struggle to fund themselves. And I would advocate that the next 50 years of American higher education policy, we devote all our attention to salvaging our public colleges and universities and keeping them or pushing them into greater affordability and not worrying about the great diversity of the American higher education system, because that's not an outcome. The outcome is our 25 to 34-year-olds ranked 16th in the OECD world in college access and completion. We are dropping about two notches every 4 years, according to the OECD measurements. And it hasn't worked. This market-based model has driven us into this academic capitalism. Sounded good in '72, but it was intended to support institutions that needed tuition dollars. And now we've got a crisis on our hands where we're talking about doubling Pell. We should not double a Pell Grant until we incentivize states to keep our institutions affordable. Otherwise, you can double or triple Pell. It won't matter in 3 to 5 years because tuition and fee increases will offset the doubling of Pell. So I would say that we are on a path of completely federalizing the American higher education system. I've had this debate with Senator Lamar Alexander, and he is a great states' rights advocate. But he needs to understand that if we continue on this path, we will allow 50 states to back out of their funding responsibilities for the next generation. Tuition and fees will continue to escalate, and the pressure will be on the back of the federal government to pick up a portion of this in grants, but a much bigger portion in student loans, which is one reason why we have the indebtedness crisis that you're reading about, that has become a presidential issue for the first time in the presidential election. That is an intergenerational issue, and it is nothing but a tax transfer from an aging America onto the backs of the next generation of students who need college attendance the most and need it more than even the previous generations. So if anything, this is a warning to countries that think that the market-based model in America has worked, because it has worked for certain institutions, but it has not worked for public higher education and public colleges and universities. And it is the opposite approach that K through 12 schools took in 1965, which was to fund schools directly for enrolling a higher percentage of low-income students. And is exactly why a voucher approach to K through 12 education is going to go down the same path as higher education. And we will be arguing about why are we funding for-profit middle schools, for-profit high schools 20 and 25 years from now. So this is a very important economic discussion. It's a highly political and regional discussion as well, because it was advanced out of the Northeast, where private higher education is dominant. In the other 3 sectors of the United States, public higher education is dominant. So this is a regional issue, geographic issue, it's a political issue, it is an economic issue. And I just have to point out that Milton Friedman has been wrong. And M.M. Chambers, who predicted all this was going to happen back in '68 and '69, if we went to this market-based approach, you will have the Wild West of funding in higher education, is exactly what we have in place in the United States, with very little control, with no sheriffs in the town. And I know that there are a number of people that have been fighting to gain the authority to ratchet some of this back, but this is an incredibly political challenging issue to ratchet back the institutions, 6,000 institutions that are funded publicly by the federal government. So it's a warning to many countries to proceed with caution. It is a warning to proceed with accountability, which the United States has very little of. And it's a warning that be careful what you wish for by wanting market-based approaches, because your public institutions will ultimately suffer. And I'll turn it back to Simon.
Well, that was brilliant, King. You did that without a single note, as far as I can see, and without relying on slides. And you laid out such a rich picture for us, and a critical one as well. I don't know anywhere where the market model has been applied as the holistic framework and things are traveling well. And we had a good webinar from Cristina Cavallo from Brazil, who, of course, Brazil had a less balanced approach, less of a public-private balance than the United States, where public values have always been fairly strong. And of course, Brazil is in this, terrible situation of being on the brink of, of a high participation massified system, but unable to really make that work properly because of reliance on the for-profit sector and, to the extent that they do. Things haven't gone quite so badly in the United States, but gee, it's such a challenging problem for policy, isn't it now? The scale of it, and the number of actors and institutions and interests involved, not least the loans industry. I'm going to ask you several questions. We've got a few people coming through, I think, into the chat soon. I've been chatting to people about questions they're preparing. So let me ask you a couple of things first. One of the features of American society that I think outsiders underestimate or don't understand fully because when they haven't lived in American society themselves, is how strong the civic dimension is, how strong the civil society is. And, the well springs of much of the creativity of American life lie there, but also there's a sense of public responsibility in many parts of the country, which you don't see everywhere. And you see it to some extent in Japan, where it's also, I think, profoundly and deeply felt. But in the United States, the country's been carried by, the civic and publicly minded citizen who's, having done well, gives back and works with others to do so. And the universities, of course, have been more publicly responsible, more publicly connected, the higher education in general has been more engaged at a civic level and in the economy and business too, than was the case in most countries. So you have the board model, the external board, the idea that the community is involved in the sector through that and so on. And that's been one of the essential balances. You've got American individualism, but you've got this sense of the public space in the civic sense, not regulated by the state in a kind of top-down manner, but something that ordinary people do in their own community to make work. And that's been tremendously important in making sure our sector is responsible and responsive. And America led the world in engagement, of higher education. Now, what does this mean when it becomes a federal model, becomes this abstract market, it becomes determined by the political economy of a market? The states are less important, they're less instrumental, they're still trying to influence things to a degree, and sometimes in ways which the sector doesn't like, but basically they're becoming less and less instrumental. What does that reduce the engagement of the sector in the community?
I have to admit that many of our institutions are guilty of this as well. But I would say from the late 40s through about 1980, a lot of the policies that we developed and a lot of the state investment in higher education was due because people understood that there are indeed societal and social benefits that accrue to everybody. Those are health benefits, those are crime-related benefits, those are tax revenue benefits. And Walter McMahon is the best at highlighting these and breaking these down and quantifying them. Since the 80s and since we've moved into this market-based model, we have become guilty as a nation in allowing the federal government to assume the state's responsibilities through these tuition-based systems, which also says that we've also allowed our legislators, state legislators in general, and the baby boomers to make assumptions that higher education is an individual benefit only. Therefore, the federal government needs to backstop students, whether it's through loans or grants, so that the student eventually pays for their college education. This wasn't the case from the 40s through the late 70s in the United States. So we have dangerously moved from a societal benefit gain to the individual benefit, therefore allowing the population that could be funding greater affordability, letting them off the hook so that the next generation that has the least amount of resources, the least income, they're the generation that needs to find the revenues to fund their own individual benefit. That's a dangerous direction in the United States. So this public assumption that existed that got us to where we were in those OECD rankings back in 1970 in the 60s. Those assumptions have driven us in the wrong direction. And now it's easily, when you talk to state legislators, and I've had very important leaders in state legislatures tell me, I need to get reelected, so I'm going to let you raise tuition. In other words, shifting the responsibility of that legislator and the taxpayer onto the backs of the students in the next generation. That's the danger zone we're in the United States. And that's why our numbers are plummeting. Our access is plummeting, and we haven't made the gains that were promised back in the 70s.
The states lack the fiscal capacity, though, don't they? This is part of the problem, most states anyway. My knowledge of the United States is largely limited to California, where I did some work. And I mean, the thing that really struck me was the way the tax base was eroded by, a series of propositions, restrictive referenda, which institutionalized a small tax approach to public life, and it's difficult for the political sphere to break out of that those constraints. Difficult to work their way through. Perhaps the energy hasn't always been there to solve that problem politically. It's been easier to let it lie. But what would you suggest in relation to the state fiscal problem? What would be the way forward?
Well, I would say, it kind of goes back. The California problem is the same problem Lamar Alexander said, Senator Alexander, we went back and forth. He said the problem with disinvesting in public higher education is that the states have to match Medicaid funding. And so he's assuming there's a finite amount of taxes that doesn't change, even though per capita income has been growing. And if higher education funding had been growing alongside of per capita income, we wouldn't be 55% below where we were in 1980 in tax effort. And that's the effort states are putting forward for higher education and public higher education. So they're at half of what the effort has declined significantly. And if these aren't finite approaches like California, these are simple, these are choices people are making, choices not to fund and to push the burden onto the next generation. So in tax effort, if we had just kept pace with with per capita income growth at the state level, we wouldn't be 55% below where we were in 1980.
Now, I know Biden's got significant constraints politically. I mean, especially in mobilizing even these 50 senators on his side at any particular moment. But what would you suggest as the major priorities for a first Biden administration and for a second one, if there is one?
Well, I think loan forgiveness is an important part of it. I mean, that's one way to force the aging population of America to support the next generation, is to address the loan issue, number one. Number two, though, is you can't make community colleges free and allow state legislatures to manipulate the funding. Because what will happen in state legislatures, they will take that funding out of the four-year institution to match what Biden is proposing for the two-year colleges. So they will wipe out the four-year funding of the public institutions immediately to provide the match that the two-year colleges need. So I would recommend that anything going forward with regard to free college, which is, I think, it's a good concept and it could help a lot, but it must not be at the expense of the four-year public institutions, of which I know legislatures tomorrow will supplant money left and right. So you need to protect the funding and the investment of the four-year public institutions if indeed you are incentivizing states to provide free two-year education.
One more question from me, and then we'll bring in our discussants. How to stop the rising tuition costs? I mean, how can this dynamic of ever increasing tuition be cut?
Well, I think it's entirely the reason tuition is what it is. I mean, you mentioned California. California was free until the mid 80s. Now we're talking about bringing back free higher education. It's interesting. This has gone completely in a circle. Now we want free college education. The key is incentivizing state legislatures to recommit to keeping their institutions affordable.
Yeah.
And that will control tuition costs. Many of our public institutions already have cost controls. They're called governors and state legislatures. Many private institutions don't. And if indeed we're going to be funding a free college movement in a 2-year system, we need to make sure that our state legislatures are accountable by putting more money back into higher education in exchange for not raising tuition and fees.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me bring in some of our chat participants. Nick Hillman, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, hi, Simon. Thank you. And I apologize. I had trouble. It was my fault logging in at the very beginning. So I apologize if you covered off this point in more detail than I think. But there was, in what I heard, lots of criticism of policymakers and elected politicians in your remarks. But they are doing their job, just like educators are doing their job, in seeking votes and chasing votes. And as someone who used to work as a political advisor to the universities minister here in the UK, I'm really interested in how you think policymakers can persuade voters of your case, and that more of their tax income to government, should be spent on the sort of policies you're advocating.
I think we must collectively get back to the understanding and promoting the social benefits of what a next generation of educated citizenry provides for everybody. And those are quantifiable. Those are less crime, less incarceration. It is much better. We have to convince the neighbor why that individual should support his neighbor's kids to go to college, not just his own or her own. And we have gotten away from that discussion. We've gotten away from that dynamic. And we have very few people actually advancing this discussion about the social benefits that are accrued to everybody, that are accrued to the baby boomers, that are accrued, because that return is still 13%, 12 or 13% on every dollar spent. That's the social benefit to every citizen of helping another citizen become better educated. And I think and many leaders like myself have played into this legislative dynamic that your voters are more important than the next generation of students. And I think if we continue on that path, then we're just going to have more and more fiscal problems, less and less tax-paying citizens, more and more discussions about student loan indebtedness, how the next generation is going to be less educationally advanced and economically advanced for the first time in the US history, is that we are in danger of having a less educated, less economically advanced next generation. It's a tough conversation to have with legislators who are only looking for votes. But we have got to turn this rhetoric around and get everybody to understand that is to their benefit to help these, especially the students that need college the most and need higher levels of educational attainment the most. It is in their best advantage that they have become tax-paying citizens and contributors, and it's in their economic advancement as well. So I think we collectively have a job to do to bring back the societal benefit discussion and convince legislators that it is in their best interest. It is indeed in their best economic interest that they support the next generation of students by keeping our institutions affordable and accessible.
So Nick, has King persuaded you that he's got an argument that you could take to Westminster and achieve some traction?
Well, I think it was a fascinating answer, and it was a fascinating presentation. I think when you make that argument here in the UK, you then get pushback in another way. You get pushback, oh, why are you only talking about education in financial terms and the financial benefits? Why are you forgetting all the societal and cultural benefits? And I know I'm being a little bit unfair in interpreting what you said that way, but that's the pushback. So I think the challenge is talking about it in that attractive way that you have, without sounding just so a bit one-dimensional, and that's the challenge, I think.
Well, you know, Nick, a good point, and I credit Parliament for stepping into this. But as Oxford and Cambridge were rapidly privatizing as fast as they could, and increasingly enrolling students from Eton, I do commend the fact that you now required them to use postal zip codes in the admissions process, so you could take into account where those students are actually from, and expanding access. And that's a simple numerical adjustment that was made. And I know Oxford and Cambridge weren't entirely in favor of it, but we have the same problem here. We have the richest institutions in the world that are enrolling the smallest number of low-income students in the country. And there's no excuse for that. And so, but these institutions also are publicly funded in multiple ways. So I think there's lots of things that politicians can do if indeed they can use the revenues, the resources they're giving to these institutions, and hold these institutions accountable.
It's surprising how firm the current Conservative government has been about widening participation in the UK. And we heard at the CG conference several weeks ago from Chris Millward, who leads the Office for Students Initiative on widening participation. And they've set some pretty tough targets, but I fear that things are being undermined by the new strand of policy, which is saying that first-generation students or prospective first-generation students ought to be thinking about further education rather than higher education. And, you know, maybe there's too many university degrees and so on. It just seems to be pushing things back to a kind of, you know, middle-class monopoly again, with the working class on the lower tier and so on. So, you know, these debates are really difficult to win, but, you know, I think there's a lot of goodwill around equity and rising and widening participation in the UK that perhaps more than there is in the US. But, you know, the University of California system has done magnificently well. You mentioned this before in ensuring a large proportion of students from low-income families and from first-generation higher education families are coming into the UC, these great UC universities. You know, these fantastic science and social science humanities-based universities, world leaders are. You know, there's a significant strand of upward mobility in the University of California, which there isn't in many world-class universities around the world.
And in fact, the two systems that are the best in social mobility in the United States that have held firm is the California State University system and the CUNY system in New York.
Yes, yes.
And Chetty's study has clearly shown that I would guess 10 out of the top 15 institutions are either in the CUNY or the California State University system in terms of enhancing social mobility, which we need to talk more about and reward more institutions for doing.
For doing that, yeah. I mean, and the key is the system approach, because I mean, when I was at Berkeley and again at UCLA, there's a lot of internal pressure to try and break away from the system and go it alone and, you know, compete more directly with Stanford and so on in all kinds of ways. But inevitably that would change the enrollment balance. It's that system discipline which enables that high component of social mobility to be sustained, I suspect.
Well, you could also point out something that I'm writing about is the great divide that has occurred between publics and privates because of this market-based model. The rich have gotten richer, and the publics now, which back in 1980 had faculty salaries which were about $1,000 difference between their private counterparts. It's now $60,000 on average. The privates are winning in so many ways in per student spending, in faculty salaries. And that puts pressure on Berkeley, that puts pressure on UCLA to try to keep pace with Stanford and Harvard and the others. And it puts pressure on Oxford and Cambridge because they're losing faculty as well to the Ivy League institutions.
Yeah, and I think the capacity of the Ivy League to support a huge number of scholarships means that they've got the pick of the crop in terms of, you know, high quality student entrance. And we feel that competition here. We just can't provide the same level of student support through scholarships. So running a high fee model in elite institutions without a strong scholarship layer is you know is a hiding to nothing. It just ensures that you remain the preserve of the rich. Let me bring in some more people. We've got Ariane de Gallarden. Sorry to keep you waiting so long, Ariane, and with your contribution be most appreciated. And Hector Rios has withdrawn because his question has been answered, but the next person after Ariane will be Astrid Favela. Ariane.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I'm actually currently teaching a course for Boston College on finance of higher education. We're discussing so many of these issues, so it's nice to hear it from someone else. I was very interested by the way you put the issue in between the federal and the state government, and the fact that the state is actually kind of, the states are kind of free riding on the fact that student support is at the federal level. And I was wondering if one of the possible solution would be to shift the burden of student support in terms of grants and student loans to the state so that they are holding that burden. And then that means that, yeah, they have, because they have the issue and the financial burden at that point, maybe it would help with riding in tuition fees and having more sensible policies regarding financing of a state public higher education.
Ariane, I think you're headed in the right direction in this, because without federal leverage, we haven't used federal leverage on states. On occasion, we have with the SSIG program, a state student aid grant program. We did with stimulus money. We told they could, back in the last recession, that you could only accept this money if you did not cut your budgets below a certain point. We have these maintenance of effort provisions that we've added into the CARES Act, into the recent stimulus packages. We need to use more federal leverage to incentivize better state behavior. And that will slow the burden on the federal government to offset the costs through tuition-based programs or tax credits or everything they've devised to try to offset it. But we've done very little at the federal government. And I use this as an analogy. I would not put any more money in the front door until you close the back door. And the federal government needs to shut the back door of the states because they're evacuating the house fast. And that's exactly what's been happening. The federal government now spends $170 billion. That's $170 billion worth of pressure they could put on states to appropriately fund and to force legislatures to do the right thing so that they could use that as an excuse. To Nick's point, I have to do this to the taxpayer or the voters, otherwise we're going to lose this federal money. One thing they do react to, state legislatures do not want to leave any federal money on the table, but they certainly like free federal money, and they've allowed this to happen. We need to take full advantage of the leverage the federal government has to encourage and reward states that are doing the right thing, and to disincentivize those states from doing the wrong thing. I've been in 15 of my 20 years as a university leader, I've lost my argument with the state legislature. That's in 4 states, including California. That's the trend nationwide. For every one good year we've had, we've lost 3 or 4 in state funding. So I don't have any faith in our state legislatures. I have faith in federal leverage.
Thanks, King. Let me bring in Astrid Favela.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Students, for your fantastic presentation. So my question is whether you envisage a similar development in the public debate in the US regarding what we are seeing in the UK regarding the cut of low value degrees, and whether you think this is a danger. Thank you.
Simon, I could barely hear the question. If you could repeat the
Yeah,
question.
and I think, Astrid, we've got sound problems and we're not hearing you well. Can you perhaps even slower and give it to us again and see how we go? If not, we'll work off something in the chat.
Okay. Do you hear me better now?
Yeah, a little better.
Okay, sorry. So my question is whether you envisage the problem of low value degrees being taking place in the UK and in the US as well? The debate that we have lately seen in the UK.
Yeah, I could hear parts of that question. I'm sorry.
It's about, we're having a debate here about low value degrees, and this is one of the things being used to put a lid on access, to be honest. The argument is that there's some categories of students and some categories of institutions and some categories of subjects, but although the emphasis is falling on the subjects which produce low earnings, low graduate earnings. This is a problem. This is seen as a bad thing. And of course, there's a concentration of low graduate earnings in the arts, humanities, social science, media communications, and so on, and at an aggregate level, and that's being used to make an argument about marginal places. Too many institutions are shopping themselves to students with poor income earning prospects, and that's where I think, it's a class matter, if you like. It's a traditional UK class problem being mobilised here, and these are the students that should be going to further education. So you can see how it's all adding up.
Yeah. Having worked on the college scorecard, where we forced institutions nationwide to report what their starting salaries are and what their starting salaries were, was a tough battle in the United States, because a lot of the institutions that were, I would call, swindler institutions, did not want to report any of that information. I think more information is better, and what we have found in studying salaries, and I know the legislative take on that is that if you don't make money when you're coming out, then we don't need to fund the program. Well, in the liberal arts, it's interesting because the liberal arts do not start as well as STEM and engineering graduates do, but by middle age, 40 to 45, they gain the most ground. Yeah. And so when the STEM students start high, they stay relatively high. The liberal arts students start much lower, but gain the most ground by middle age, which also means they're changing their jobs 4 or 5 times and succeeding in society. I think more work needs to be done in this area so that we don't end up with the simplistic analysis that says that these students should simply go here because you have a high starting salary, but that may not get any better as you get older. So I think more analysis needs to be done on the outcomes of higher education. And what we're learning in the United States, especially having been through, this will be my 4th economic recession in a university, that parents and students pay more attention to outcomes now than they ever have, because costs are so high. And for decades in the United States, we had many institutions that said, trust us, we're worth it. Now people are saying, oh, you need to give me more information. And we had universities charging $75,000 a year and say, trust us, we're worth it. Parents don't want to hear that anymore. They want to know what happens to your graduates. And I think the more outcomes-based information that we can put into the public, the more that we can justify greater tax assistance as well.
But it needs to be long-term outcomes as well as starting salaries next week. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? That those starting salaries next week are easy to gather, but longer term outcomes are more problematic. But I think we've ducked that challenge to some extent. I think you're absolutely right, though. More information, the better. It's the only way to go in the end. Information is powerful too. It makes a difference. Now we've got Se-Yong Lee, and Se-Yong will be followed by Jocelyn Krause. So Se-Yong.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. So I had 2 questions actually, but I'll just ask 1 question. So as you said about this information that you have to, that universities give to students and families to persuade them to pay and invest a lot of money in university education. In South Korea, 80%, almost 80% of the universities are private institutions, and students pay lots of money to the universities. And we've got a world top tertiary enrollment rate in the world. And so I was wondering, and people take it for granted, this paying lots of money to universities. So I was wondering if that could be maybe possible future for US higher education, if students and parents see higher education as maybe, I don't know, not only investment, but other meaning like Korean. I don't know, maybe it's cultural differences. What do you think?
Well, I would say that judging by the progress and the numbers that you have made in South Korea in the OECD rankings, you are making some important investments that are working. And there is a more of a societal understanding of expanding educational attainment to the next generation. We're in sort of a UK argument right now, and there are people still saying that not everybody should go to college. And I kind of equate that to Rick Santorum, the former senator from Pennsylvania, who ran as president and said, not everybody should go to college. And then they asked him, what about your 7 kids? He said, well, they're all going. It's the Santorum effect. In the United States, we have people saying that not everybody should go to college. They're talking about somebody else's kid that shouldn't go to college, not their own. And we're having that debate, and it goes on. And we had a debate the last 4 years that colleges and universities aren't for everybody. Well, they may not be for everybody, but everybody should have an opportunity to make that decision for themselves. And that's the debate we're in the United States. And to some extent, I hear it in Simon's discussion in the UK that we slip back into that notion that not everybody should go. Well, everybody should have an opportunity to attend and have the resources or the affordability to attend, and let them make those decisions with good outcomes-based information that they know about.
So Young, you've provoked an excellent answer. So you might want to ask your other question or questions as well. We've got time.
Really? Okay, that's great. Thank you. So another question that I asked earlier was, do you think, is there any relation between the increasing number of international students in US higher education and the lowered state tax effort and more market-based privatization of higher education in the US?
So that's a very good question. International students, as I mentioned earlier, certainly UK funded the 90s on international students that in the Further and Higher Education Act that they opened it up. Margaret Thatcher didn't fund it. Many of our international students help fund our institutions, certainly, but in most cases, they're seen as like out-of-state students. What does worry me is that many of our public institutions, in their movement to privatize their activities, are going to turn to international student recruitment and out-of-state students at the expense of the in-state students, generally the lower income in-state students that will suffer from that. So I do think the recruitment, the last 4 years hasn't helped the United States in international recruitment because of just last year, for example, we would have accepted clearly a couple 100,000 international students that did not receive any educational visas. We shut the door. I see an intense recruitment effort coming back in the United States of international students, but I also see it as part of the privatization model. As I've seen many institutions that used to serve their own states are now serving 70 to 80% out-of-state students and international students at the expense of their in-state kids, students.
Thanks for your answer again, King, and thanks, Sayong, for your contribution. Now, can we bring in Jocelyn Krause?
Hello. Hi, everyone. Nice seeing some familiar faces, and thank you for this presentation. I'm loving it. I also asked 2 questions similar to So Young, but I'll ask my first. The second one is about liberal arts, and we've kind of talked about that. The first one is actually, I'll throw it on a personal note related to some work I've done previously at universities with the real estate office and endowment and alumni and major gifts and patents and licensing and all this. So I'm wondering your thoughts on these alternative revenue streams. I'll admit I'm not that familiar with it for public universities. And being an American student here in the UK, I'll add in, it's been funny how many UK students have asked me, like, do alumni really give to their college? And I'm like, yeah, that's just how it is. I thought that was a fact of life. And I didn't realize maybe it wasn't as dominant outside the United States. And obviously major gifts is a huge movement. I know many people who work in that field. So any thoughts you have on all those alternative revenue streams? And I probably haven't even named all of them. So thank you.
So it's a great question. And having been at St. Peter's College in Oxford, when the development office started in 1991, they didn't even have the list of the alumni. They didn't even know who their alums were. They had to put an ad in the London Times. If you're a St. Peter's grad, will you please call the office? And
It would have worked.
and that's one reason why most Oxford colleges in their development campaign efforts are set up in New York City. And they've got offices in New York. And alumni giving, the assumption in the UK is that the state takes care of the institutions. It's kind of like what it used to be 30 years ago in the United States. We still combat some of that with many alums. Endowments are important. They help around the margin. They help the margin of excellence. But what state legislators and politicians don't understand is, and then 99% of endowment funds they're restricted. They do not go to keeping the lights on. They do not go to paying faculty salaries. They're restricted for building purposes. They're restricted for scholarship purposes. They're restricted for endowed chair purposes. And I've had legislators tell us, just use your endowment this year and we'll help you next year. And I've had to, it's hard to even educate them to understand that you can't do that. Nobody will ever give a dime to your university again. Endowments are important, but the key here in funding and keeping the lights on and paying faculty and staff salaries is either going to be your state support or tuition and fee support. That is the operational fund that you have to use. And that's one reason why out-of-state students have become more attractive, is because they bring in more tuition revenues. The endowments are important, but they help around the edges. And unless you're Harvard and you've got 40 billion in the bank. But that is just a handful of institutions that can even have that type of financial assets that are sitting there just making, some would argue they're a hedge fund operation now. So, but you're right. It's hard to get people to give in the UK back to their institutions.
Thanks, King, and thanks, Jocelyn. Can we bring in Zach Spire?
Good morning from San Diego, and many thanks, Professor King. My question is related to your point about how universities are going to rebalance the funding, and whether or not you foresee in that rebalance, they will do what many people in my area of research talk about, which is compete for direct investment by incentivizing tuition payments or tuition repayment for people who have already completed further education or higher education. Because it seems to me that if the state is to uptake more of the responsibility as you propose, that automatically, in California, for example, we're still the 5th largest by GDP, if I'm not mistaken, 5th to 7th in the world still. That incentivizes a certain already pre-existing, sort of framework and financial capacity. The UCs are what they are. The CSUs are what they are, in no small part because of the tax base that has been here for 40 or 50 years, right? So right. I see this as a bigger conversation, like people competing or cities competing for Amazon's business or Amazon's new headquarters. There was a huge article written about that not too far off, and how the state will do that, because it seems to me that your premise will lead to us fighting each other as states too, if we're going to incentivize repayments or payments for tuition. Yeah.
I would say I'd say we're already doing that.
Agreed.
The reason Amazon is looking at San Diego is it is low crime, higher educational attainment, a good workforce. I think that competition is already at a heightened level. And that's why many states, I had to convince people in Louisiana, you don't get on many people's list because you're 50th in everything. And you never even know if you've made the Amazon list because they didn't even consider, they're already considering San Diego. And And the more students you educate, and you get 2 million students in California in the community college sector, you got another 180,000 in the UCs and 500,000 in the CSUs. I would still say that California is doing a pretty good job, much better job than most states at understanding and protecting access. I'm less worried about California as I am about Virginia, Arizona, Colorado, for example. If Colorado continues on its trajectory, by the year 2025, it will not spend a single public penny on higher education in the state of Colorado. And so though most of the states are moving in a much faster trajectory than California. I'd say California is already engaged in that competitive model, and having a higher educated workforce is why Amazon and why anybody else is looking at California.
Well, King, I think you've started a terrific discussion today, and one that we haven't been able to finish because the issues are too large for us to finish in an hour. And I think now that people will take note of what you're saying in the public space and look for your words, because you've been very, very erudite today, and you've opened up, I think, our knowledge of the complexity of these debates, as well as the hit points that you've highlighted so well for us. A lot at stake, I think, for the US and for all of us in American higher education, sorting out its system design, its underpinning political economy, and maybe the cultural attitudes to higher education that go with that, in the way that economics sort of shapes the way we think and behave. We've gone, as you say, down the wrong track. In many countries with the market model, it's going to be hard to disentangle ourselves from it. But the pandemic is helping us to think again about the balance between public values and private good, and getting that right, and making sure the two of them are working together rather than against each other. That might help us with higher education a little bit in rethinking it as well. But it looks to me like it's going to be a state-by-state problem in the United States, regardless of how effective Biden is. And he seems to be more effective than many believed he would be. But his task is enormous, and there's only some things you should do from the federal level. Well, hopefully we'll have you back on, because I think either in a panel or again presenting on your own, because your knowledge, your wisdom is tremendously valuable at global level, and perhaps we haven't seen enough of it outside the United States. You've been a tremendous actor inside the country, and you've made an enormous contribution, but your words are important worldwide as well. So we'll keep that in mind. Can I encourage everyone to come along again to the CG webinar, 2 o'clock spot UK time next Tuesday, where we have Marek Kwiek, one of the leading scholars of science and higher education in the world. Marek Kwiek from Poland, from the University of Poznan, and he's going to be talking to us about the increasing power of the individual scientist in the global system. So we think about states, we think about state power, state surveillance, all these things that are worrying us about states. And then, but the science story, there's another story, which is about the role of collegial communities, connections across borders, individuals in leading a kind of global science system, which is partly running on its own momentum outside the framework of political governance. And tremendously important, because what we know at global level in science is very instrumental in deciding our future. So come along and hear Marek put the argument about the role of the individual and the discipline in science as distinct from policy next Tuesday. We look forward to seeing you all then. We look forward to seeing you again, King, and thank you again for your wonderful contribution today. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.